opportunities for activists to spend a little bit of time thinking about things that, just giving them space, clearing their head to think about things that are really important to them, to look at practice that they're really interested in, that can strengthen what it is that they do in their work. And so we were delighted that Jeannie was a fellow through the Social Change Initiative, and specifically her interest in looking at the role of public procurement and how can public procurement be a driver of change. And so we're delighted today that this is a panel discussion where we're going to find out more around the experience of what's available in Northern Ireland to make that really fly and to give that legs. £3 billion of expenditure is public procured each year. And so how do we make sure that that expenditure is not doing any damage, that it is human rights compliant, that it is basically we're looking globally and we're looking to see what is the impact of how we spend and how can we ensure what we spend is not doing damage in other places. So it's a discussion, it's about information in terms of what's happening here in Northern Ireland and the opportunity that exists really to make a difference and to use procurement in a way that can drive social change. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Patrick and really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Hopefully, am I mic'd? I'm okay, I think, without that hand mic, so we'll set it down there. So, listen, delighted to see you all here. Thanks for coming, and thank you to the Imagine Belfast Festival for giving us a platform for this discussion. I think it slots right in there, the interface between the people and government and doing public good. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, here in person and also joining us remotely on screen in one case. Going to talk about Stormont's supply chains and how our taxes can be used as a force for public good, as Pawlicki has already sort of explained. A few housekeeping things. If you are tweeting, and we actually welcome you keeping your phone turned on for a change at these events, so keep it on, keep the sound off. If you are tweeting about it to bring others into the conversation, please use the hashtag #ImagineBelfast. So brilliant lineup of speakers. I'm going to chair the bit of Q&A later on. There will be a chance for questions. We'll come back to that later, tell you how to do that. Whether you are with us in person at Accidental Theatre or whether you are joining us online. So our first speaker, and really going to set the scene for this discussion and the other speakers to follow, is Jeannie McCann. And Jeannie recently joined the Strategic Investment Board as a social value advisor. So she advises the public sector in Northern Ireland on approaches to maximise what's called social value, primarily in the area of services contracts. Before joining SIB, Jeannie worked in civil society for the last 12 years, including most recently at Trocra, where she worked on its business and human rights advocacy. And last year, as Pawlicki has touched on, she was ordered a fellowship by the Social Change Initiative to research how to act locally on global issues. And I worked with Jeannie on this particular piece of work over the last year, and I'm delighted to keep that going here today. So, Jeannie, hand to you.
Hello everyone, delighted to be here. And so I think we all know that we live in a very small, interconnected world that's facing multiple challenges. And so our peaceful, shared and sustainable future requires us to consider global challenges as well as local ones. So through the SCI Fellowship, and with Patrick's support, I've hugely appreciated the opportunity to look at this in the context of human rights and global supply chains and how government spending power can be used to create positive change. So many of the items that we use in our everyday lives come from all over the world and could be tainted by human rights abuses. And it's no different when it comes to the items the government procures to deliver essential public services, so PPE, timber, laptops, mobile phones. And so what abuses could be happening? Sweatshops, child labour, poor working conditions, land grabs, pollution and toxic waste. And the industries that we know that there's high risks include agriculture and mining, logging, construction, electronics and the garment industry. And so there's been some very stark and high profile examples. For example, in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed. It housed 5 factories that was making clothes for Europe, and over 1,000 people were killed, mostly women who were working in the factory, and over 2,500 people were injured. And another example that some of you will be familiar with and heard me speak about before is in Honduras, and this is Rosalina Dominguez, who's a community leader from Rio Blanco. And I met Rosalina whenever I worked for Trocra in Honduras, and at the time she was leading her community's struggle against a hydroelectric dam that was being built in their community without their consent. And so for the indigenous Lenca people, their river is sacred, and the dam would have changed the river's flow, leaving it dry where the community accessed it. There also would have been no community benefits, so the electricity that would have been generated would have been transmitted straight out of the community for big business such as the extractive industry. Eventually, the community managed to halt the construction of the dam, but at a very heavy price. They faced years of attacks, intimidation, and even murder, and Rosalina has received many threats. The dam was being financed by European investors, including some with public funds. And the investors eventually pulled out after a murder of a high-profile community member. But the intimidation was happening whenever they were investing. And so the experience of Rosalina and her community is not unique. According to Global Witness, last year 200 land and environmental defenders were murdered. That's 4 people every week. And so during a climate and energy crisis, Rosalina's experience is more relevant than ever to all of us. Of course, we need to reduce our carbon emissions, but we can't trample on people's rights in the process. And that's the case for hydroelectric dams, but also for the raw materials that we need for solar panels or electric vehicles. And so social movements in the Global South, which Rosalina and her community are part of leading, are calling for stronger regulation to hold companies to account for these abuses. And leveraging government spending power to help create change is an important part of that puzzle. So governments can ensure companies operate ethically and are sustainable when they do business on their behalf anywhere in the world, and in turn that should help influence the behaviour of the companies more generally beyond the contract. And so now there's an increasing emphasis on public sector and companies to do mandatory human rights due diligence, which is essentially about assessing and addressing the impact on people in supply chains. So the aim is to prevent the abuse from happening in the first place. So what does that mean? It should involve mapping out your supply chain, identifying the actual harms or the potential risks, putting systems in place to prevent the abuse from happening, monitoring these systems, and then reporting on what action has been taken in a transparent manner. And throughout all of this, there's ongoing engagement with stakeholders, including the community. So it's an ongoing process. It's not a once-off exercise. And so shortly we'll hear from other speakers around how Northern Ireland is already on a path to all of this through modern slavery requirements and the introduction of a public procurement note on human rights. And so as was said at the start, every year the Northern Ireland government spends upwards of £3 billion on public contracts. This is significant spend which can be leveraged to help create change. Thank you.
Jeannie, thanks very much. So just a wee note on the chance to ask questions for later. So we're going to have a few other speakers now. Each will be going no more than 5 minutes, so we hope to have a chance for a proper conversation at the end of it. You don't have to wait, though, right until the end to ask your questions. We have, by the magic of these QR codes and I think a website address that's given there, you can ask questions online, and then I have a little iPad and I'll come to them, and hopefully we'll be able to run through a few fairly efficiently later on. So just follow the instructions on the sign there on the screen. So to the next speaker. So David Russell is the Chief Executive of the Human Rights Commission. The Commission has been working on business and human rights for quite a number of years, including the drafting of the recently published public policy note on human rights and public procurement for Northern Ireland Executive Departments, and has also been involved in the establishment of the Northern Ireland Business and Human Rights Forum. And David's going to speak about the Northern Ireland Executive's policy on human rights in public procurement.
Thank you, Patrick. Oh, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. So, picking up where Jeannie left off, where did the stone for this building come from? How was it extracted? Who owns the company that provided it? How do they treat their workers and their families? How is it packaged and shipped? What wider causes does the company support? These are some of the questions that are just as likely, if not increasingly more likely, to determine the buying power of consumers and the attitudes of the general public as to how projects are delivered. An industry, as in every area of life in which human rights are engaged, would be wise to assume a prudent amount of caution, if not scepticism, and simply accepting the case that human rights is convincing and concluding that this will be enough in order for companies to do the right thing is really not sufficient in practice. The former chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights reflected on this a few years ago and came to the conclusion, I'm just quoting him directly, he said, "I've led firms in various industries and operated within several cultural environments and have come to understand that businesses are machines designed to do certain things and will always strive to do them as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. The loudest calls within a company for higher goals are distant echoes, if even a whisper for profit exists. And I'm deeply wary of chief executive officers who claim to be guided by a moral compass, because ultimately they only navigate the waters their shareholders chart." Salva-Nathan suggested then, if we want businesses to respect human rights, then what that constitutes needs to be made mandatory for them. I think there's 2 points here worth considering. First, private sector companies respect boundaries and they crave clarity. That's almost a rallying call we'll all be familiar with these days. It's been most visibly demonstrated in Brexit, and representatives of industry have repeatedly called on government requesting assurances and certainty on the plan to leave and now on the plan for future trading arrangements, and we all wait to see the outcome of it. And secondly, companies are social creations and they reflect our values. They are in part defined by the rules that governments lay down, and we might hope that businesses create wealth and drive our economy and that they act virtuously. But when a company acts contrary to our expectations and believes that it can do so because there are no rules in place or consequences for their actions, well then we might reasonably ask who is to blame for such behaviour. Allowing market forces to dictate the conduct of or private sector enterprises and solely relying on their sense of what's often referred to as corporate social responsibility really doesn't provide enough of a restraint quite often. You might be wondering what that's about. I think that the little proverb is quite apt in this context. So, see no evil in this context really means you've simply failed to look properly. And hear no evil means you've failed to listen attentively enough. And speak no evil means you've either failed to ask the right questions or hold your contractors to account, or both. These were some of the underpinning assumptions that led to the creation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights back in 2011, and which led several years later to the work of the Human Rights Commission alongside the Department of Finance, which resulted in the mandating of the 2021 Public Procurement Note from the Northern Ireland Executive. And here's probably the most overused quote in human rights history, but I'm going to use it, not least because it's the 75th anniversary year of the Universal Declaration. You know, you're all probably familiar with it, Eleanor Roosevelt. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? And her response was, in the small places. Well, the reason why it's relevant to this debate in particular is a company with fewer than 50 staff that imports minerals, trades with the extractive industry in a country where there's violent conflict, will have a very high human rights risk profile, and such a company should have policies and processes proportionate to that risk, regardless of its size, to ensure that it isn't involved in abuses. For some time, and I have in good authority, this came from a Supreme Court judge in a private conversation, but whoever said it, for some time, public procurement might reasonably have been characterised as the ticking time bomb of human rights. For too long, there was minimal appreciation, either by the public sector or businesses, of the risks associated with failing to conduct due diligence in this regard. And the risks are obviously massive: reputational, financial, legal, and there's lots of examples. Nursing care homes, domiciliary care, the management of detention facilities, prisons, social security, eligibility assessments, and the list goes on as the amount of things that have been contracted out to private sector companies. And the good news is, which was often overlooked, is that quite often these companies are captured by the Human Rights Act. So the Act states any person certain of whose functions are of a public nature qualifies as a public authority and is therefore potentially liable for acting unlawfully. This means that any company undertaking the function or functions of a public nature is in effect under the direct obligation to respect human rights law, parallel to those of the government. This is what was missing. Even though it's ingrained throughout many other pieces of legislation with the Human Rights Act overlaid. If you think, for example, in the context of European directives transposed into the UK's domestic law prior to Brexit, they include provisions for creating incentives to exercise due diligence quite often. The directive on disclosure of non-financial and diversity information, for instance, requires certain large businesses to report publicly on their policies, procedures, principal risks, manage those risks, including human rights risks, and similarly, the EU regulation on supply chain due diligence placed obligations on importers of metals originating from conflict-affected areas, which I mentioned earlier, and high-risk areas to ensure that they comply with human rights operations and obligations outside of the jurisdiction. So even based here, working in other countries, the human rights obligations have extraterritorial effect. So briefly, because I know my time's running out, the procurement note. The companies can do lots, but what in effect the PPN has done in Northern Ireland is, for the first time, public authorities engaging with private sector companies now have to frame all of their projects in accordance with the procurement guidance note, as mandated in 2021. And this basically involves procurement professionals creating frameworks to determine that the level of risk involved in each contract and a general scoring matrix that awards due diligence and compliance with human rights standards to those private sector companies who are performing well. Producing a procurement or sourcing strategy that identifies potential human rights abuses and puts measures in place to mitigate them is also advised within the PPN. And finally, providing details to the Department of Finance on the actions taken to address human rights risks for publication in the annual procurement report. There's much more in the document, but in many ways it's a general document that has to be given life by the contracting authorities, and that's what we're busy doing at the minute. With as many as are coming forward to the Commission. I would single out, if I had to, at the minute, Northern Ireland Water, who I think are doing a sterling effort with their procurement team. And looking forward then for the PPN and how it might be embedded by Commission authorities, what we're looking to do, we think, is support them with potentially another project. For businesses, I think the next stage in Northern Ireland is that we need to celebrate the good practice that exists, but also be able to call out bad practice when we see it, or the increased risk of human rights abuses. And in my view, what that means, potentially, one thing that we're looking at is a longitudinal type project to develop a human rights index of companies that sits alongside the PPN, and which provides open access and transparent data that ranks businesses, and in particular those businesses that are competing for public contracts. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Great stuff, David. And thanks for, I suppose, introducing us a little bit more detail into that public procurement note that published in the last year or so. And I know from talking to my colleague, Peter Frankenthal in Amnesty UK, who leads our work on business and human rights. He says that that procurement note, in terms of the requirements it sets for government and public procurement, sets us ahead of the rest of the UK, at least as things stand. I know there's further legislation coming from Westminster in due course, but we do have an opportunity to leverage that now to ensure human rights due diligence and that our supply chains are clean here. So we're going to move now to the next two speakers from within government, sort of officials within government departments who will be helping to ensure adherence to this and to other reporting requirements. So first of all, Richard Black. Richard is the Pursue Lead in the Department of Justice's Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking branch on a 2-year secondment. Richard has worked before that within 4 different district councils here as an environmental health officer specialising in environmental protection, and Richard is going to discuss modern slavery requirements in our devolved context.
Thank you very much. Folks, as saying there, my name is Richard Black and I work in the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking branch in the Department of Justice. I'm going to tell you a bit about modern slavery and human trafficking first of all. So what is modern slavery and human trafficking? Modern slavery is where one person controls another for profit by exploiting their vulnerability. And the trafficking adds the element of moving or transporting that individual. So modern slavery and trafficking, the legislation, it's a devolved issue, modern slavery and trafficking. In 2015, legislation was introduced through the Assembly following a private member's bill based on the 3 Ps of pursue, protect and prevent. The Department developed a modern slavery and trafficking strategy in partnership with key stakeholders. The strategy is currently published yearly, but changes in legislation has meant that this strategy will move to a 3-year strategy. So we've just carried out a public consultation on the movement to a 3-year strategy, and the draft strategy will hopefully be published as a final version of the strategy later this year. I'm going to talk a wee bit about transparency in supply chains, or TISC. Some of you might be aware of what TISC is, some of you may not. Why is it important? TISC is found under Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, 2015. So that's the English legislation, but extends to Northern Ireland through legislative consent motion. Any commercial organisation with a turnover of over 36 million, the trades or partially trades anywhere in the UK must have a slavery statement in place. The UK government plan to extend TISC to public sector organisations that meet the same criteria. And while this is in the pipeline, there's no date when the UK government plan to legislate for this measure. So what should your statement include? It is recommended that your statement covers the following areas. This includes information on your organisation's structure and its supply chains, details of the policies for the organisation, which could include procurement, staff training, risk assessments that could look at reports on trafficking around the world, such as the Trafficking in People report, the TIP report, which is produced in America. Due diligence processes might highlight potential risks. So these risks could be country, sector, or supplier specific. Targets to measure the effectiveness of your statement, and what training is provided for regarding modern slavery and human trafficking for your staff. Your statement should be transparent, it should target actions, and it should demonstrate year-on-year progress. In 2021 March, the UK government launched the Modern Slavery Statement Registry. This can be accessed by anyone who wants to look at ideas in relation to publishing a statement or for information regarding an organisation's statement. There's also guidance that's been produced. The link is on that slide there, and I can share the slides afterwards, on how to develop a statement and what it should include. And there's also an email address for a contact in the Home Office there on development of modern slavery statements. So the benefits of a modern slavery statement for your business. It improves brand recognition by showing a business organisation have steps in place to ensure its supply chains are free of modern slavery and trafficking, which in turn shines a positive light on that business. This in turn could lead to an increase in sales and customer loyalty as customers seek businesses with higher ethical standards. Your business may attract more talented workforce, and there could be longer staff retention. while the business may grow in size with more outside investment and overall responsive and stable supply chains. I've just put a slide there for some context. If anybody has any, well, if I've come across aspects of modern human trafficking, I know it's probably some people don't realise what they are, like when we have awareness sessions that we try and raise what to look out for. If you do have any inkling that somebody might be a victim of slavery trafficking, I would encourage everyone to ring 999 in the case of emergency, or 101 for general advice. There's also the modern slavery helpline, which can be contacted on that number, and also a link and email address to the modern slavery helpline. 2 useful links for businesses. Modern slavery human rights in business is a very useful document, which provides a wealth of information for businesses on steps to take forward to reduce the risk of modern slavery human trafficking from occurring within their supply chains, and promote awareness around modern slavery human trafficking by carrying out steps in-house. There's also a British standard there, BS 25700. It's a free British standard for anybody to download, but it will give them a wealth of information and help them as well in ensuring that their organisation remains free from modern slavery human trafficking. If anybody has any further information that I can answer today, please email msht@justice-ni.gov.uk, and one of the team will be able to hopefully get back to you with the answer you're looking for. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Getting through a lot of information in a short time. Appreciate that. So our next speaker is Donna Williams from the Department of Finance. Donna has 23 years experience working in public sector procurement, so we're delighted to have you with us today. She's Director of Supplies and Services in Construction and Procurement Delivery, which is a centre of procurement expertise within the Department of Finance. Donna has responsibility for procurement delivery of supplies and services for the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Departments, their agencies and arm's length bodies, approximately 140 different organisations, and we've already heard a little bit about the scale of the budgets involved there. So Donna's going to outline for us how all of this works in terms of operationalising it. So,
thank you. I hope I can read this. I need glasses shortly. As people have mentioned, this is a very serious issue. It's, the money involved, $2.5 billion to $3 billion per annum, is 25% of the Northern Ireland bloc, so we clearly have commercial leverage. And more than that, we have a legal obligation. There's a very strong legislative framework between fair work regulations, procurement policy notes, the Modern Slavery Act, the Human Rights Act, etc. Personally, I think we also have moral and ethical obligations for public expenditure. We only want to deal with ethical firms. As public spending organisations, we quite rightly have a lot of oversight, scrutiny of public expenditure from the Audit Office, for example, Public Accounts Committee and the Finance Committees. And obviously there's serious reputational damage when we get things wrong, but we don't want to get things wrong because we value people over profit. Moving on, just to mention very briefly, I look after the civil service departments. However, there are 6 other centres of procurement expertise who have a lot of expenditure and a lot of commercial leverage. So that's the likes of the Education Authority, TransLink, NI Water, who David mentioned earlier, the Housing Executive and Department of Infrastructure, and Procurement and Logistics Service, who buy for the health trusts. And they all operate under the same policy and legislative framework, which my teams do. So what is an ethical, human rights-based approach to public procurement? It's really important as it's used to prevent human rights violations and abuses, and it's by taking an active role in respecting, protecting and fulfilling human rights. And it should be considered by procurement practitioners at the very earliest opportunity and commissioning departments. And this can be done through pre-market engagement, the formulation of the procurement strategy and the route to market. As David mentioned, we have the procurement policy note on human rights. So what this actually mandates and what we enshrine in the contract and what becomes a contractual obligation in public sector contracts across Northern Ireland is that the contractors must demonstrate the measures that they have in place to ensure that workers in our supply chains are employed ethically. So this includes establishing a human rights, modern slavery prevention policy, and very importantly, the processes in place that address human trafficking and modern slavery issues throughout their supply chain. It's about being responsible and proactive, identifying sourcing strategies or sourcing countries or regions where there is a high risk of human rights abuse and taking appropriate steps to address these sourcing from these high-risk areas. And in our contracts, there's a zero tolerance policy on violence, exploitation and abuse of children and workers throughout the supply chain. It's linked to termination clauses, though quite often, if it's further down the supply chain, it might not have to be a termination event. It might be a more positive thing to work with the third or second tier contractor to try and improve conditions in that area. But it's about ensuring all workers in the supply chain are paid in line with national pay rates. I wanted to mention we have some complementary public procurement policy notes that I'm not sure if everybody's aware of, which are actually a brilliant tool when you're tackling modern slavery and transparency in supply chains. And so we have a PPN on supply chain resilience. And this arose out of the pandemic, post-pandemic experience of PPE procurement. And we're looking at supply chain modelling to determine risk and build more resilience into supply chains and to the planning of risk responses. And it's about mapping supply chains for those critical supply contracts, your food, PPE, fuel, things like that. But it's about engaging with suppliers to trace the source of the materials. It's about being intelligent buyers, knowing the component parts of what you're buying, particularly in the likes of IT, and understanding where the pressures and the leverage is. And then it's using a supply chain mapping exercise, which also then obviously identifies human rights and modern slavery risks, which is absolutely critical going forward, because it's through rooting out that no supply chain is free of modern slavery. We would be very naive to think that. But putting these policies, putting the contractual mechanisms in place is an excellent driver forward. We also have a policy on scoring social value, and I just wanted to mention it very briefly because as part of theme 4, and I'm working with ethical companies, it's mandatory in our contracts over the UK threshold, approximately 138,000, that we have to have 10% of the award criteria is social value. So there's a big commercial lever for somebody. It could be a tipping point in a contract. And so theme 4 deals with building ethical and resilient supply chains, and it's about tackling employment inequality, reducing the risk of modern slavery and human rights abuses within the supply chain, and about promoting the diversity and security of supply chains. And what I think was really good in this policy note as well, it also introduced the payment of the living wage from June 22 in our service contracts, because there's labour exploitation and abuses in our local supply chains, in service industries, in the hotels sector, cleaning, catering, security guarding. And we've now made it mandatory that we're a living wage employer, and our contractors are living wage employers for our public sector contracts, which I think is a tremendous step forward for the public sector. So how do we operationalise it? First thing we did, we had a human rights action plan. And the first thing is you had your key drivers and your key foundation stones are your policies. And thanks to the support of the Human Rights Commission and my policy colleagues, we have great policies in place and complementary policies. It's really important that your staff are trained, that they understand what the policies are, what the obligations are. So all of my staff complete the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply ethical procurement training. It's completed annually and it's part of your chartered status. You have to do it. We also did additional training through the Government Commercial College about tackling modern slavery and supply chain, and it had a particularly interesting PPE case study. And we also, just last year, at the end of last year, we attended some Themis, a seminar and training session on preventing modern slavery and human trafficking. And it targeted really at the financial sector and banking sector on what you can do to try and address modern slavery in those supply chains. Okay. So policy into practice. So before some of these policies actually came in Northern Ireland, we were trying to take small steps forward ourselves. We were early adopters, and we're very proud of that. So, for instance, in security guarding, there was a lot of labour exploitation. There was people were circumventing payment of the minimum wage by making contractor staff pay for their uniforms. They weren't paying for their training, weren't paying for their travel. So when we were reprocuring, we did a deep dive and deep audit of the contracts. We audited all of the staff, and we rooted out some of these very poor practices and raced to the bottom line. And what we introduced as mandatory was payment of the living wage. We also made sure that the contractor provided the good quality uniform and PPE equipment, and they had enough changes. They didn't have to buy any of it themselves. That they had appropriate training, HR and disciplinary procedures for their personnel, and that the contractor had to develop and maintain a human rights policy that demonstrates their activities that show due consideration to human rights. The contractor must also have a nominated named person with responsibility for human rights. So you raise the profile and the importance of it, in the company and in the contract, and they're required to complete an annual human rights statement. Within all of our contracts, we reserve the right to survey the contractor staff, and Workforce Matters, and I think that's a very effective tool. And this can deep dive into the organisational culture. We have access to terms and conditions for placements, staff policies, including grievance procedures, whistleblowing, anything like that. Human rights considerations are also a standing item on our. We have biannual strategic reviews with our big contractors, and the department reserved the right to audit at any time throughout the contract period. So this model that we apply to security also applies to cleaning services, maintenance, any sort of high labour content. And we also ask for evidence that they're actually being paid the living wage. We have open book accounting, and we ask for the rates paid to staff and the charge out rate as well, so that there's good due diligence in that respect. Just talk briefly about the food contracts, because we tried to take a more proactive approach. This was prior to any of the policies being published. This was a couple of years ago. And we were trying to follow the Welsh model, where they had ethical employment in supply chains. And they're at least a couple of years ahead of us in their journey. So they published that back in 2017. So we started to introduce this into our food contracts, as we recognised agri-food is a really high-risk area, as well as processing of food. My team had responsibility for prison service food contracts. It's a very small footprint, but for us it was very important that we sourced ethically. So we incorporated a human rights-based approach into the contract management schedule, because we didn't have the other policies in place at that time, and we thought that was the best place for it. But what it has done, it has resulted in contractors establishing a human rights modern slavery prevention policy, and they have processes in place for due diligence. They identify the sourcing countries and regions where there's high risk of human rights abuses. They provide training to their staff on modern slavery. Involved in supply chain management. It's particularly important when you're dealing with small producers, like the apple and the mushroom pickers, things like that. You have to know how to spot the signs. And we have a zero tolerance policy written in on violence, exploitation and abuse of children and workers throughout the supply chains. And we also have fair payment, ensuring that all workers are paid in line with national pay rates. I just wanted to signpost you to some guidance that the UK government actually just brought out last month, just at the end of February there. And it's about tackling modern slavery and supply chains. And this is aimed at procurement and commercial practitioners at all levels. And I would urge anyone who works in public procurement to have a look at it. It's really good guidance, some really good tools and tips in it. I would also say that we have a new procurement bill that's coming out, due to be published towards the end of this springtime. And modern slavery is kind of front and centre. There's a debarment list, for example. And also one of the great leaps forward, I think, we've always tendered on the basis of the meat, most economically advantageous tender. We're now going to move to, in the new procurement bill, they're going to remove the word economic, and we're going to tender on the basis of the MAT. So it's the most advantageous tender. And that's because people matter. It's about value. It's not about the lowest price. It's not about the race to the bottom line. It's about trying to do things better, better value for money, better quality standards, more ethical sourcing and procurement. And that's me. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Super, Donna, that was really clear. Again, you got through an awful lot of information, but really appreciated those examples, how to sort of, work it through. So our next and our final speaker, before we come to the discussion, the question and answer bit, and I see that some of you have already mastered the answering of questions, so keep them coming and we'll try and get through as many as possible in the last section. So our next and final speaker, Peter Pawlicki. Peter is from Electronics Watch, which is an NGO that works in several countries to support public sector organisations with responsible public procurement. He's Director of Outreach and Education, spent more than 20 years researching the globalisation of the electronics industry and its effects on working conditions and labour rights. Before coming to Electronics Watch, he coordinated projects at IG Metall, the German metal workers union. So he's going to share with us tips for preventing human rights abuses from entering supply chains. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to Northern Ireland. I'll be talking briefly about Electronics Watch, and we've already heard a lot about what is going on in supply chains. Electronics is unfortunately a supply chain that is riddled with issues. It starts basically at your doorstep whenever you buy whatever electronics device you want. Basically in final assembly, you will already find things like forced labor. So there is unfortunately not a good supply chain, a fair product that you can find. But the nice thing that public buyers can actually do is, once they set up contractual obligations, and we heard about them already in previous presentations. One way is obviously to ask the companies to set up policies and set up specific management systems to really make sure that they are implemented. But we always say it's really good to have these systems in place, but also it's really good to be able to control whether compliance is in place. And the best way to control it for public buyers is to basically do it on their own. Having said that, I'm very much aware that public buyers are not really the experts in human rights in supply chains. Plus, they have to manage a lot of supply chains. It ranges from stones to electronics devices to services to anything that they are procuring. So that's a big challenge here. And this is why Electronics Watch was developed. What we basically do is we support organizations and public buyers that affiliate with us in monitoring their supply chains and in making sure that they understand where the factories are, so location of factory, supply chain transparency, that they understand what kind of risks and what kind of violations they are looking at within specific supply chains. And also not only knowing what the big challenge is and what the risks are, but also working towards remediation. So really working with the supply chain, engaging with suppliers to really see improvement. This is the core of our work. The interesting part, and I think the great part about the electronic supply chain, is everybody is buying basically the same things from, say, 5 to 6 brands. That makes it quite easy to engage with suppliers, and especially with our affiliates that are now ranging 900 plus. On this map, you are seeing in green the countries where we have affiliates. It's mostly Europe, but also Australia. So because these public buyers band together, they collaborate, they cooperate towards similar or same requirements towards the industry, and they buy the same things from the same supply chains, they have leverage, and they have more leverage than they actually would have if they would be alone. Now, on this map, you also see red countries. That's actually the countries we are doing the monitoring in. So obviously electronics, everybody kind of knows it's China. It's not only China. China is the biggest location, but it's a lot of other countries. It's countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, India. It's also countries like Poland, Czechia, and Hungary, where actually quite a lot of big bulky things are being produced, like desktops. So we have monitoring partners in all of these countries, and they talk to workers, they ask workers about their grievances, and they collect them. And we then can go to the industry and talk about this and try to find remediation paths. But we also know that the supply chains don't end with manufacturing, they go down to raw materials, to minerals. So we also look in countries like Bolivia, Congo, or Philippines and Indonesia on specific minerals like lithium, like nickel, like tin or cobalt. I'm always pushing the wrong thing. Okay, so this is basically what we do, but we help public buyers that affiliate with us to really understand their supply chain, to have a overview of violations in their supply chain, and to be able to work with the industry towards remediation. Now, this sounds huge. This is a really big challenge to get there, to be able to not only include contractual obligations, but actually act on them. And I'm very often asked, so where do we ask? And where do we start? And I always say, just start somewhere. Take the first step, but be aware that this is a process. This is a year-long process. You will be going on a journey. You need to start the journey as fast as possible. You need to learn while you walk. You need to basically be very much aware where you want to be in 5 or 10 years, and then just start walking. Really, the first step is the most important one. The organizations in public procurement, they are learning a lot, and they are getting there. But it's not a one-off exercise. It will take a long time. We have already achieved quite a huge supply chain transparency. What does it mean? So public buyers currently actually are able to understand pretty quickly where their factories are. And that's really important. They know for this product, my factory is in China, it's in Poland, and there are some factories in Malaysia that are also linked to this. This gives them obviously an understanding of risk. And this gives them an understanding of how to talk to their supply chain on what needs to be changed. And it's also very important that remediation, that everything a public buyer does is informed by the fact that this is not to comply with specific rules, that this is not to fulfill the next Excel sheet, but in the end, this is about improving the lives and livelihoods of workers and affected communities. I know that this is often kind of lost in the complexities of procurement, but this is really, really important. The great part that actually happened by the end of this year, and we are right now working with them towards a tender, is that the Crown Commercial Services, they have affiliated with Electronics Watch. So what does it mean? CCS is now a member of Electronics Watch. We work with them. They are now developing a new framework agreement that will be tendered within the next weeks and will be signed by the end of this year. And this will give then local authorities and organizations in the UK the capacity to really work on these issues through a framework that actually has pretty strong details and pretty strong standards. How to do that best? Well, the best way is, again, it's not only about the contractual obligations. You need to be able to monitor for their compliance. So we will work we already work with universities in the UK very strongly, but also with local authorities to really bring that framework into life. And then I hope in the next years we will see a huge impact, not only the impact we have seen up until now, but Crown Commercial Service actually has volumes that go even beyond what Northern Ireland has, because it's the entire UK. So this will be a great step. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Much appreciated you joining us, and hopefully you can stay with us now for the question session. Now, we're very tight for time because we're due to run this as a 1-hour event, so I think maybe we have about 15 minutes left, if even that. So thanks very much to everybody, whether online or in person here, who has submitted questions via the electronic question asker machine. So I'm going to maybe direct some questions to particular individuals, and otherwise I'll maybe just take, if there are any volunteers, to pick up on some of the points. I'm going to take the last question received maybe first of all, and it's maybe one particularly for you, Richard, in terms of the DOJ. And the question from Gavin Miller asking, is the Department of Justice writing to local councils and the police requesting that they take a lead by voluntarily completing modern slavery statements?
Thanks, Gavin. At the minute, with the development of a 3-year strategy, we're looking at extending awareness raising for TISC. So we will be contacting organisations and having awareness sessions for all sectors. The police would be under the public sector organisations at the minute, and that legislation hasn't come into effect yet. But whenever the legislation does, we will be then extending the awareness to public sector organisations as well as commercial sector organisations. We haven't written to them yet, is the answer to Gavin's question, but we will be engaging with all organisations and raising TISC.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that answers it, Gavin. I want to move on to talking about an issue that was highlighted maybe in the title of this event, but maybe hasn't been touched on so much. So Declan Owens from Eco Justice Ireland says, the title refers to procurement to protect the planet, but this has not really been addressed. Could the panellists address this, please? So I think, Jeannie, you touched on it somewhat, particularly your Honduras example wasn't simply about the human rights impact, but the environmental impact there. So I don't know if you maybe want to pick up on that and what you have seen.
Yeah, so I think, like I alluded to it in my talk, is that the human rights conversation needs to run alongside the sustainability conversation as well. And so whenever we're looking at the emissions in supply chains or circular economy in the supply chains, running alongside that, we also need to consider the impact on human rights. So if we need to reduce our carbon emissions very quickly, which needs to happen, our economy needs to change very significantly, and how we procure things needs to change significantly, and we need to ensure therefore that the human rights aspect runs alongside that too. And so we see the two going hand in hand, but it is difficult. The human rights and environmental impacts, they're often difficult to separate them because they're interlinked, particularly at community level.
Okay, maybe Donna, you maybe could pick up on this question from Rebecca Corbett, and it's about circular procurement practices, and maybe you can explain that as well to us. But so it says, are there any public bodies in Northern Ireland trialling circular public procurement practices, or are there any resources to support public bodies in embedding circular principles within procurement?
I guess we are making some inroads in terms of procurement from cradle to the grave. We're also working with social enterprises and the whole social economy as well. Under the public procurement regulations, you can actually reserve contracts for organisations who work largely with disadvantaged or disabled peoples. We have some good contracts in place with those for disposal of confidential waste, and we're looking to expand that actually into the waste sector and the recycling area as well.
Okay, and maybe a follow-on question from that again, just about, I suppose it's about good practice and about how we move on from here. So a question from Laura Fitzpatrick. Would it be worthwhile establishing a knowledge-sharing group on implementation of the human rights PPN? So I guess knowledge sharing for COPE, so I guess for maybe the bodies that are actually doing the public procurement.
Yes, certainly, and some of that structure is in place. So we have a heads of procurement group that meet monthly or bi-monthly, and that is representative of some of those organisations I mentioned earlier, so Education Authority, Translink, ourselves, Health. We also have a K-Hub, which is it's a UK-wide hub. And we have the Northern Ireland region, and we can reach out and we connect with councils as well. So it's free to all public sector procurers or commercial, anyone with commercial or contract management. So they can join that hub, and I would encourage anyone who wants to join the hub, please join it. And that's a great way to communicate. We also, previously we had practitioner forums in certain category areas, high risk areas. So unfortunately, a lot of that kind of fell by the wayside with COVID as we were all kind of redirected elsewhere in terms of getting PPE, etc. But I think there is an ambition at some point to try and resurrect those shared practitioner groups across the coast where we're targeting specific areas and looking to improve particular areas and take a more joined up approach and strategic approach.
Okay, thank you. Maybe David, a question could direct to you and the Commission. It's around the Human Rights Act. So a question from Mark McAllister. Are there any ways in which certain articles within the Human Rights Act might be in conflict with one another in this context of public procurement and human rights? For example, he cites freedom of expression versus right to privacy and family life. So that's maybe a more general question, but I'm just wondering in the context of public procurement, do you see any issues of contention where rights are clashing, and maybe makes it more difficult for either for the public procuring body or for the contractors, for the companies involved?
I have to say no. It's not often I get to answer a question just like that, but no, so far I haven't seen anything, and certainly no one we've engaged with in terms of the department or the public bodies have been raising issues of concern. Mostly, well, I'll give you one sort of example, but with Northern Ireland Water, the sorts of things that we have been looking at is maybe where the contractor could overstep the mark in terms of rights protections at a very grassroots level. So, for example, Northern Ireland Water, even things like laying water mains, maybe on private property and how that engages property rights. But in terms of two sets of rights conflicting with each other, no, not really. It's not that sort of area.
Okay, listen, that's great, thank you. I have an issue maybe could direct to you, Peter, and given your background in working with a trade union in Germany, so Declan again has asked, labour rights are human rights, no dispute there, so why have trade unions not been mentioned in any of the presentations? So maybe we can just expand that out or talk about how we can involve trade unions as watchdogs for labour rights within the supply chain, and if any of the other panellists in the room want to pick up on that from their own experience as well. But directed to you, Peter, first of all, I think it's a great area for exploration.
Well, that's a really good question. So there are various reasons why trade unions have not been mentioned. First, for example, in electronics, there are almost no trade unions. We are looking at locations at production regions like China or Vietnam, where you don't have independent and democratically elected trade unions. And you have an industry that is actually actively opposing trade unions. So they are pushing trade union and organizers out. They are intimidating them. So that's kind of on the regional perspective. However, whenever we find and we know about trade unions, like in countries like in Malaysia or in the Philippines, we always actively work with them because obviously, first, they know best what workers actually are experiencing and what they want, because they are, if it's a real trade union, democratically elected as a representative of worker interest.
Okay.
When we go to Europe, we also work with trade unions. There is a challenge, though, at least from my experience in Germany. Trade unions in Germany are very locally focused. Their perspective on global supply chain is, to put it positively, it can be better developed over the years, so we hope to really go there. They have to look locally. They're elected by their members, so they look locally. However, we have seen, and I've worked actually in Germany already with trade unions on these issues of public procurement, especially in establishing minimum wages or living wage standards in procurement. So this is possible. I think that always depends on what kind of sector you're looking at. Construction is a good sector, food, kind of like canteens, and any service, like local service related issues. This is where I think public buyers and trade unions should be talking much more, because there you actually don't need organizations like Electronics Watch. You have a trade union, you have a works council that you could actually be talking to. I think it's a very new issue for trade unions to really think about public procurement, but also for public buyers to think about trade unions as a potential source of intelligence. So I think this should be developed, but it's not there yet, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to fire one more question to you, Peter, and that's around how, in the work of Electronics Watch, how do you consult with the rights holders, or more specifically, the victims of human rights abuses? How do you consult with them, make sure their voice is heard?
Yeah, a great question. So basically, not we in me or one of my staff colleagues, we work with local civil society organizations as monitoring partners. These are labor rights activists, labor rights organizations, human rights defenders that basically do the interviews with the rights holders. So they will go to a factory and stand in front of the factory, or to villages to understand when they know workers from these villages go to this factory, and they will do off-site interviews with workers. This is really important to give workers kind of a safe space, to make sure that they feel safe and that they are able to share what grievances they have. And especially if you are talking to labor rights, to forced labor victims, there is also the challenge of language, right? This is very often migrant workers coming from different regions or different countries, speaking a different language, feeling very vulnerable. So this is basically where our source material on data comes from. Then it's really important for us to make sure that while we use the data, we don't endanger any of our interviewees, so they can also feel safe.
Okay, thank you. And because time is beating us here, it's going to be the final question. David, I'm going to direct it to you. What are the next steps? What are the crucial things that need to be done now to take advantage of this new PPN? And also thinking about concerned individuals who might be, watching this event, whether they are just members of the public or members of a trade union or a civil society campaigning organisation. What is it that they might be able to do as well to ensure that their taxes and their government is doing the right thing in this regard?
Well, the critical thing is that all of the public authorities that are subject to the PPN, the procurement teams, need to start producing the frameworks. Some are doing it. I think some are probably ahead of the curve from others, but there's no, as far as I'm aware, standardised approach as of yet. So what we need to see is that each department, every public authority, everyone that was named, that they have a procurement team working and creating the frameworks and ensuring that they're in place, and in response to those that want to ensure that it's operating effectively. I think holding those public authorities to account is the first thing that can be done to make sure that they are actually doing it. So a collective effort there would be great, because it won't be worth the paper it's written on if it isn't given life in the actual tendering processes. And the truth is, for a long time, as mentioned before we started this event, this was a long time in Genesis. I think the Commission has probably been working on it with the Department of Finance somewhere between 7 and 10 years to get us to this point. But it is a good news story for Northern Ireland. We are ahead of the curve with having this very firm framework now in place, but it needs to be given life. And for me, and I mentioned it in the presentation, I think there's another piece of work now to assist public authorities alongside it, which is a company indexing approach. We're exploring how that might be done so that there is effectively the top 100. The difficulty in Northern Ireland is high reliance on small to medium enterprises, not so many multinationals, and so what that will look like in practice needs to be worked through. But if you had the two things together, we would be really, really sort of getting the energy and moving the thing forward.
All right, thank you, David. And I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word on this discussion for today, but the work isn't going to stop here, as you've heard. So I just want to say a few thank yous, obviously, to our speakers, to Peter, to Donna, to Richard, to David, to Jeannie for organising this in particular and leading the way. To Accidental Theatre for hosting us, much appreciated, and the loaning of all your great technology to make sure we got through as many questions as possible as well, and for live streaming it for us, to Social Change Initiative for really being behind the whole project, and for Jeannie's fellowship that enabled her to explore this further. To all of you who have come along in person or online, and for sending in your questions, whether or not we got to them or not. So thank you to all of you. I'm going to just finish up by again thanking Imagine Festival for hosting us, and give a plug to other events. It's running all week, this festival. Absolutely brilliant setup, brilliant lineup of events, most of them free to get to as well, online and in person all around the town. I'm going to plug two events in particular. First of all, an Amnesty International one, sorry, abusing the chair. And that's tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the Crescent Arts Centre. And it's a colleague of mine who runs our United Nations office in New York, talking about moving from being like a war correspondent for Al Jazeera and others to being a human rights activist. So come along to that if you can, 5 o'clock tomorrow, Crescent Arts Centre. And another event on Friday at 8 o'clock in the Crescent Arts Centre as well, homing in on human rights, presenting Irish journalist Sally Hayden, a human rights advocate from Uganda, a writer and medical anthropologist Stella Nyanzi, in conversation with Liz McManus with poetry in Arabic and English by Amar Al-Najjar, and that's homing in on human rights. So, and many, many other great events in the festival as well. So thank you all to everybody. Thank you to yourselves. Thank you. Thank you.